This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
All right, well, welcome. Are we blasting out? Okay. So it's interesting to know why different people have come, because it is kind of a strange topic. I noticed that when Jordan sent the announcements out for the RVML events, he changed the title from Aligning with the World Tree to The Growing Momentum for Evolution of Consciousness. And I'm sure that was because he thought that, people would relate to that topic more. But I said, yeah, but I really am speaking on the world tree. Surprise! And I have to say that no one is more surprised than I am to be giving a talk on the world tree. I enjoy public speaking, and I feel, many different topics that I'd be qualified and interested to speak on, and the world tree wouldn't be on the list. But nonetheless, I come here with a strong sense of inner urging that this is an important topic, and one that by strange coincidence of circumstances and life experience, I'm somehow become a seed person for helping to bring awareness to this. And after this talk, I'm hoping that you all will become new seed persons to help spread this awareness. So one of the main dangers and challenges for me with this talk is I'm trying to do way too much. And I'm forewarning you of that, because what that means is I'm going to be making broad strokes, and I'm not going to be able necessarily to slow down and fill in the details. And I feel okay about that, because part of my role, I think, is to share ideas, share information, and then if you're stimulated, if you're curious and interested, to give you references of where you can go and pursue more about that. So I'm very happy to do that. And so I see part of my role is to use my speaking ability to share ideas and information. My main work, however, is energetic. And so my main work will be done through the workshops, which hopefully some of you might be moved to come to, where we actually energetically attune to what we will be talking about here. Let me give you the overview of what I'm going to try to cover, and then we'll jump right into it. Okay, so I'm going to share a little bit of how I come to be here, my personal experience with some of this, okay? Then I'm going to speak a little bit on the world tree itself, not in any great detail, but a little bit to kind of put that out there. Then I'm going to go in and start speaking on the Mayan calendar, using that as a basis for understanding the world tree, okay? And I'm also going to try to give you a big overview of the Mayan calendar and what it provides in terms of understanding what stage we're at in this evolution of consciousness, okay? Having given you a very broad stroke, okay, without filling in a lot of detail, because I just won't have time to do that, then I want to save time to really go into this current, what's called an underworld that we're in, which is the Galactic Underworld. Carl Calleman, whose book I'm using for this information, states that the Galactic Underworld is the apocalyptic age. And the Galactic Underworld started in January of 1999, so we're in the midst of it now. And if the prophetic ability of the Mayan calendar holds true, which there's good information that it's been accurate when you look at it historically, which is what I'm going to try to lay the groundwork of, then it gives us some important clues and awareness to have as we move through these next few years, okay? So I'm going to try to address that so that when you walk out of here, you're not going to be an expert on the Mayan calendar any more than I am. I am not an expert on the Mayan calendar. My inner authority to speak really is more about the world tree, which I do have my own direct experience and awareness of. But I find the Mayan calendar has added an important dimension of understanding about that. And then at the end, I want to come back then and talk about the world tree and talk about my vision of what I see. You know, oftentimes many of us refer to ourselves or are referred to as light workers. But I prefer the title caretaker of the earth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and tie the world tree into the constellations work that I do and that Bert Hellinger developed, and that has been how I've come to understand a lot of this experientially, is through the constellations work. So I want to draw on, I have some quotes from Bert Hellinger that I want to draw on and hopefully tie everything together before we walk out of here. So that's the overview of what we're going to cover. Welcome. And so it's not that people can't ask questions, but I'm going to warn you that probably a lot of you might have really good questions, and I won't necessarily take the time to answer them unless it happens to be part of this particular focus that I'm trying to cover. Okay? But if I'm saying something and you're totally lost, let me know. Usually I can tell that as I look out at people. Okay? And you know, there may be parts of it that you won't register, but that's okay, because the seed gets planted. Okay? So, where to speak in terms of... years ago, many, many moons ago, I was interested in Jungian psychology, and I was reading a lot in that kind of field. And I read a man named Mircea Eliade. I'm probably mispronouncing the name, but do you know who I mean? Yes. Okay? Famous mythologist, kind of precursor to Joseph Campbell. He's written a lot of wonderful books studying the symbology and mythology of early cultures on the planet. Really brilliant, in-depth kind of look. And I remember it was a time in my life I had started out religious or spiritually, mystically oriented as a child, and then totally put that behind me as a teenager and young person. And this was a time in my life when I was kind of coming back, checking out spirituality and trying to see if I could relate to it in a way that, you know, made sense to me. And so I came up with the criteria to use, which is I figured if something was repeated across time and across culture, then there must be something to it. You know, I decided that was a good operating principle. And it was fascinating to me all these years later. I don't remember a lot of detail from Mircea Eliade. Haven't gone back to reread him in years. But what I've always remembered from his work is he said that every culture, every traditional culture had this notion of an axis or a center. And oftentimes they would talk of where they lived as being the center or the navel of the world. They'd have a mountain that they used, or they'd put up a stake that they used. And he talked about how central that was. And it was called the axis mundi. Mundi is the Latin for world. So axis. And he emphasized how important that was across culture and across time. And the axis emphasizes the vertical aspect, but it's similar or related to what is then called the world tree. And the world tree, the tree aspect, brings in the symbolism of aliveness, for one thing, and of movement, because the branches reach up and out and the roots reach out. But the tree notion is related to the axis notion nonetheless. And then for the axis, when you introduce the horizontal, that's where you get the cross, okay? So again, like when the missionaries arrived in South America, there were crosses already up, crosses that were painted green, because that was their symbol for the world tree, okay? already planted. Now, where this becomes important, and you just think about it, wherever you are living, in order to establish east, west, south, all of that, you do it from where you're at. You make a center point, and then you gain your sense of direction from that. So it makes sense that wherever you are becomes part of that grid, right? And yet, we talk about, and when we get into this understanding of the Galactic Underworld, one of the claims he makes for it is that we're at a stage of evolution of transcending the differences between the East and the West. And when we talk about East and the West in the world, we all kind of have a unified idea or an agreement of where that is. So that's what starts to imply that there's a central axis for the planet. Do you see that basic idea? And if you look at the globe, later maybe I'll be able to share some of his documentation for his belief that the basic, if you look at the 13-degree latitude, which runs down and divides kind of Western Europe from Eastern Europe, comes right down through Rome and then comes down through the heart of Africa, including Chad. That's what Calleman believes is the central axis where the world tree penetrates through. And we demarcate east and west from that central axis in a planetary sense. Okay? Does that make sense to people in just that beginning rudimentary way? So by having the cross or the tree to provide this grid, that's how in traditional cultures then you get this idea of the medicine wheel that provides the four directions. And in this work, you're going to see as we get into it, what's important isn't so much the idea of direction, but what are called the four winds. Which way are the winds or the currents of history moving, okay? So I know that maybe all seems a little abstract to start with, but if you bear with me, I think we'll get this all woven in. Okay, so here I am, all these many years ago, reading about this and being fascinated and being convinced that there must be something to it, but I never ran into it again, never did anything with it. It's just kind of like dropped into the unconscious, right? Until 13 months ago. In a conscious way. Now I realize looking back that in an experiential way I'd connected with it. But it was 13 months ago. I was staying down in the Menlo Park area near Stanford University. And someone had sent me through the email an article by Calleman about the Mayan Calendar. Now, let me tell you that I was friends with Barbara Hand Clow back in 1982, 83, that time period we were classmates together. So I was introduced to the Mayan calendar early on, was aware of it. My life went through a major upheaval at this time of the harmonic convergence, So I've been aware of this over the years, but I'd never particularly been drawn to it, never. And a lot of times when I heard people talking about the Mayan calendar, it was in a way that I just didn't resonate with, and sometimes, in fact, found not helpful at all. So I'd never really checked it out, even though I had a lot of respect for the Mayan culture and knew that, there was something there. So 13 months ago, I get this article. I liked it well enough. I went into his website, which I don't often do. I'm not an internet surfer. And I saw that, lo and behold, he was in the United States, and he was giving a talk at a bookstore in Menlo Park, like within the week. So, I get the clues and I go to the talk. And as this man starts speaking, I am just like on fire inside with excitement, because what he's presenting is bringing so many things together that I was just, really just so excited. So I ended up, of course, going to his workshop and buying his book. And the thing about it that he talks about is, in the third chapter of the book, early on, he has the world tree cosmology, okay? So he started talking about it. And again, I'll lay the groundwork, hopefully, as we go along here. But at this point, all I wanted to say is, it was just so exciting to me to suddenly have a framework that started to make sense of so many things that I'd heard about or knew about, because I know that one of the things we've lost that we're now starting to regain is a mythological understanding, knowing how to approach the world through a symbolic and mythological understanding. That was part of what was largely lost in the West from the time of the Enlightenment on with the rise of scientific materialism. But now we're coming back to it, and you'll see that this underworld that we're in is supporting that even further. So even then, I never would have dreamt. I started reading and trying to understand it, and it's a leap. How many, show of hands, how many people have read a little on the Mayan calendar? Okay, good. That will be helpful. But it is, I found at least, a leap, because you have to it's a whole different worldview. So they use language in such a different way than we do. So for instance, Calleman made the point right up front. We think about measuring time. In the Mayan language, there is no word for time. So they don't relate to time in the way we do. And yet, if you look at all the texts that existed in the Mayan culture, most of which were destroyed when the conquistadors came in, but the few that survived, all of them are calendars. So obviously they put tremendous emphasis on calendars, but what they meant by it or understood by it isn't so much a measurement of time in a quantitative sense, but it's an understanding of the spiritual quality or the spiritual intention, the spiritual flow of evolution, okay? And to them, they use the basic measurement. They use a lot of them, and most of them I'm not going to try to get into here, but they use the basic measurement they call a ton, T-U-N, which is equivalent of 360 days, and that's what they consider a year. Now, it's not that they didn't know that a solar year is 365 days. Of course, they knew that. But it's interesting, not only the Mayans, but the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Jewish, all the old calendars were based on a 360-day year, okay? And that's because that's considered the spiritual dimension. So they're not dealing with the solar-based physical dimension. They're working with the emanations coming spiritually. Do you get that? So that's one of the interesting, again, these cross-references where you realize, okay, many calendars use the 360-day count, okay? Another aspect that is confusing is they talk about, and one of the basic things, I've got my first ever PowerPoint presentation, which will hopefully develop some of this, but two of the basic things they talk about and use is what they call the 13 heavens and the 9 underworlds. Okay, does that ring a bell with people? And when we think heaven, we think of a place, maybe an otherworldly place, but we tend to think place. But that's not at all what they mean by heaven. What they mean by heaven is a quality of time or a stage in a creation cycle of time, okay? So you have to constantly, when you're studying it, you have to constantly retrain your awareness when you hear these words, what is being talked about. Same thing, when they say 9 underworlds, they're not meaning a location. They're meaning, by an underworld, what they mean is a stage of evolution, okay? And so it's a totally different concept. And a friend of mine I was talking to, and she said, well, why do they call it an underworld? Which is a really good question. And as we get into this, hopefully it will start to make more sense, because it relates again to this notion of the world tree. But they call it an underworld probably because these evolutionary stages develop in response to the emanations from the world tree, which is the energetic core of the planet. So there's a sense in which it does relate to the underworld, what we'd call the underworld, or the core of the planet. Do you see? So that's an interesting notion, but that's how this concept of 9 underworld stages of evolution, because it's a response to these energetic emanations. Okay, I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and jump into the PowerPoint presentation. Before I do that, are there any questions or response just to this much before we, I'm hoping that by giving you a few visuals, it will help you take in the awareness. Are we okay? All right. So now, do you move these through, or do I? I do, okay. It's good to know. Let's move this over here for now. You know, I'm going to, one of the slides, one of the early slides is going to be a symbol that they use for what they call the Hunab Ku. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right. And that refers not just to the world tree, but to the cosmic tree, which hopefully will become clear as we go along. And I wanted to put up the words in Norse, because again, these are universal concepts. The cosmic tree is referred to as Yggdrasil. I have no idea how you say that. That's why I wrote it down. That's the Norse word for it. And in the Vedic tradition, it's called Molam. So I wanted to write those down just to show you, again, we're talking about something that's universally been known and represented. So what do I do just to get started? Whoops. Oops. Let me. So that's just to show you the cover of the book by Calleman that I'm using. How many people here have looked at this book? Are you familiar with this one? Okay, couple. If any of you at the end are interested in more information, his website is simply www.calleman.com. So it's a very easy one to access. And there's lots of information always available on his site, lots of articles and things like that. It's Calleman, his last name, .com. Okay? So this is the book that I'm drawing on for this talk in terms of the Mayan calendar. Now, this is early in the book, and this is where he's trying to describe how this what he calls holographic resonance between the cosmic tree, the world tree, and our brains or our being function. And it's such a limited image or chart, in my opinion, that I almost didn't use it. But nonetheless, with all of its limitations, it does communicate something. So this he's showing as the Milky Way. That points to this idea that there's a cosmic tree or axis, okay, that sends out somehow these resonances, these pulse waves of energy that become part of the evolutionary impulse. And those, one reason this is limited is it would actually go then to the sun, and then from the sun to our planet. But he's simplified it and is just showing it going from the cosmic tree to the world tree. So there's the axis representing that, and then how it emanates and affects our brains. Now there is another diagram that we could use that I didn't, that shows the whole human being, which I actually like because then the axis is through the heart, and I think the heart is the critical matter. But he's interested as well. Calleman happens to be a PhD biologist. He was a doctor for the World Health Organization before he got totally absorbed in understanding and teaching about the Mayan calendar. So he's very interested in the brain and brain resonance and how it works. And as we go along, if I have any success at all, these different underworlds affect, or I should say the emanations from the world tree come through in a different way from different underworlds. And that stimulates different parts of the planet and different parts of our brain. So that we're coming out of a period of history that was very supportive for the Western hemisphere on the planet and for the left side of the brain for us. And that's why it's been such a rational, scientific time, because that's what the world tree was supporting. And the support for that has now shifted, okay? So that's what we'll hopefully be able to explain as we go along. So this gives you some visual sense of these emanations coming and influencing. But in a way, it would be better drawn, I think, as kind of like maybe concentric circles, because that's how they work, really. It's like if we line up with our inner core, we are automatically lining up with these other inner cores. So really drawing them as concentric circles and then the emanations moving would, I think, in some ways be more effective. And also, I didn't have time to come up with a picture of it, but do you know from geometry the shape called a torus? Okay? Really, the torus is what we're talking about when we talk about the world tree. And so I'll have to come up with a drawing of that. But for those of you that know the torus, that's really symbolically, when we say world tree, isn't that a beautiful depiction of the same energy flow of a torus, okay? So that was a neat association for me when I made it. Okay, so there's the basic idea of the world tree. I want to read you a quote now from the book. And really, this is kind of could be the summary statement, in a way, for the whole talk. So here's the quote. By the way, I'll just interject here. When I decided to give this talk, much to my amazement, 13 months after I first heard about it, which is kind of interesting in terms of, as we see, number 13 has a significance, I wrote to Calleman, and I told him I wanted to call it Aligning with the World Tree, and I wasn't at all sure what he was going to think about that. And I ran the idea past him, and he wrote back, and he said, I was so pleased. He said, in my opinion, you cannot understand the Mayan calendar without understanding the world tree, and most people don't grasp that. So that was very encouraging to me. I felt like I was on the right track. And then sure enough, when I reread the book in preparing, I noticed this quote. The fundamental truth about the Mayan calendar is that it describes the exact timing of the pulses and vibrations from the world tree that determine the evolution of consciousness. Okay? That's a pretty flat-out strong statement there. And he says, once we start to be aware of the Mayan calendar, we start to see not random events through history or in the news, but we start to see evidence of a pattern, of an unfolding pattern that reflects a divine plan, okay? That is what is really exciting when you start to grok that. Here's another quote. He says, the evolution of consciousness is directly related to the heartbeat of Mother Earth, okay? Another way of saying it, okay? The idea, again, of the axis provides the yin-yang polarity. This produces creative tension along the line where it oscillates, and this is what gives rise to different movements in different directions, what were called the winds of history or the winds of change, okay? Hopefully we can describe that more later, but and these different underworlds, the pulsations come in and resonate, sometimes moving outward from the axis, and sometimes moving east towards the axis. And it affects then and stimulates, again, like I said, different parts of the planet and different parts of our brains. Okay? Let's go to the next one. Okay. So, Don helped me put together the PowerPoint presentation, and as soon as he saw this, he said, oh, yin-yang. But this is the Mayan depiction of what they call the Hunab Ku, okay? So it's like a Mayan yin-yang symbol for the central sun of the universal world tree, what they call the one source of limits and energy. So this is, again, the cosmic level, not the world level. But the idea is that evolution proceeds from these pulse-wise emanations that create a wave movement, okay? So these are the other names for it in other cultures. It points to the creative principle of the universe that by itself is non-physical in nature. Because it is non-physical, no worldly force can in the long run withstand the winds of history. It's beyond human manipulation, okay? If you read his book, he emphasizes that over and over again, that it's not a physical level thing. And I think that's important too, because I've always been interested in the big picture of evolution, okay? And I probably have the dubious distinction of being one of the few people who's actually read the entire book that Eric Newman wrote called The Origins and History of Human Consciousness. I've also read, Ken Wilber's book, Up from Medan, The Transpersonal View of Human Evolution. I've been interested in things like that. I've also been a professional astrologer, so I've also had a fascination to look at history using astrological transits and awareness and trying to see, is there a pattern, can you understand it? And this is what was so exciting to me when I finally ran across Calleman's interpretation of the Mayan calendar, because I have not run across anything in all my years of interest that explains and fits the movement of history on the planet better than the Mayan calendar. And so that's my plug. Now, if you hear Calleman talk or if you read his book, he spends a lot of time documenting that, which is what I'm not going to be able to do much of in this talk. But it is very well documented in historically accepted events. He doesn't take any speculation about, the existence of Lemuria or Atlantis or anything like that. He sticks with what is accepted history, from a mainstream point of view. So, okay, I don't know how I got off on that, but. Now, I'm not going to leave this up very long at all, but this is his basic chart for explaining the 13 heavens. And I'm showing it very briefly just to show that if you get into the whole Mayan viewpoint, they correlate all these heavens to different gods and goddesses, and those gods and goddesses are symbolic of different types of energy. That's an important thing to remember. Numbers to the Mayans were not about quantities, they were about qualities. So each of these numbers represents a quality of energy, and it represents a stage in a cycle of creation, okay? And when we get into the underworlds, each of the underworlds goes through this 13-phase development, okay? Does that make sense? But what I did is I tried to break it down really simple for people. We're not going to talk about the gods and goddesses part of it. We're just going to look at the basic, bare bones idea of what are the 13 heavens. And this is one of the ideas that was very exciting to me. Something else in his talk that made sense, not only of the world tree, or what in the book of Genesis is called the tree of life, okay? But he started to make sense also in the book of Genesis of the whole creation story. Because what they're calling heavens in the Genesis story is the 7 days and 6 nights of God's creation. And this is where, again, you get the idea of why they call it a heaven. Because it is an impulse in a religious term, God's divine plan, or just, a cosmic impulse, but something that is transhuman, trans-worldly. So they refer to it as a heaven. But heaven 1 is day 1, and the quality of energy associated with that is sowing, okay, the basic beginning. What they call heaven 2 is night 1, and that's an assimilating energy. Heaven 3 is day 2, germination. Do you get that basic idea? So every time you see heaven, you've got to think not in terms of spatial, you have to think in terms of a stage in a creation cycle that corresponds exactly to the stage that's depicted in the book of Genesis. So I found that extremely exciting myself. And the awareness here that we're going to see as we start to apply these 13 heavens to these different stages of evolution that they call underworlds is that the days, so the odd-numbered heavens, which are the days, are the active times. And the even-numbered heavens, or the nights, are where what was initiated or put into place strongly during the daytime is now somehow absorbed or worked with or reacted against or in some cases destroyed in order to make way for the new, okay? So I'm not going to read them all off, but this is as simple as I could break it down for you in terms of making the connection between heavens, days, and the basic quality of energy or the place in the cycle of creation. Okay? Are there any questions or reactions just to this before we move on to the underworlds?
Where's night 7?
It's complete. It's a 13. You know how in, like we're going to anticipate the apocalyptic age, but like in the book of Revelations, they talk about 7, 7, 7. 7 is a significant number, not only in the Bible, but elsewhere. So the 7, let me, I don't have a picture of this, but I'll try to wrap it in. So this is a Mayan pyramid, okay? And the Mayan pyramids, unlike the Egyptian ones, are built in levels. And this one from Palenque is built in 9 levels. They do them 2 ways. They do a 9-level pyramid, and the 9 levels are then for the 9 underworlds, okay? And that's what we're going to talk about. But they also do a 7-level. And if it's a 7 level, then it's representing the 13 heavens, okay? Because it's 7 up and then 6 to come down. So the 7th is the zenith part. And then the total turns out to be 13. So 13 is a very significant number in the Maya cosmology, okay?
And 7 is half of 13.
Yes.
And you were saying that we're about 4? Day or night? We're number 4 right now?
We are in the Galactic Underworld. We are at the midpoint of night 4. Mm-hmm.
So
And hopefully that will start.
7 and 7's half of 13.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Will you go over once more the distinction between the heaven and the underworld in terms of this cosmology?
Yes. They're interrelated, but the 13 is a cycle of creation. Okay? It's a creative cycle.
Okay.
Whereas the underworld, which is what this pyramid represents, are 9 levels of consciousness.
Oh, okay.
So the underworlds are stages of evolution. And we're going to talk about this quite a bit, these underworlds. But I wanted to show you this picture. I'm going to show you the picture again later, but I'm showing you the picture now because visually, you know how much a picture communicates. One, it's just impressive to see their pyramids, right? And to be reminded of what an amazing culture it is. And by the way, I meant to start off with expressing gratitude and acknowledgement to the Mayan elders and the Mayan culture for preserving the wisdom that's been preserved and handed down. So I'll take this moment to do that now, being reminded of the amazing culture that they did have. So what I want you to visually take in, and this will hopefully help you as we talk about these levels of evolution then, is you see how the base, like the first level of evolution, develops, and then the second level arises out of it. It doesn't replace it. Okay, that's very important. The next level of consciousness does not replace the previous one. It arises out of it and adds something new to it. So there's a certain sense in which it transcends it, but it is not a replacement. So they all end up building on one another. And it's only as you move through one, then the next level emerges, and then the next one, and then the next one. And they represented 9 as, again, the resolution. So, and this is as good a point as any to mention, because you're soon going to see this. I found that many people, if they don't know anything else about the Mayan calendar, what they think they know is that it ends at winter solstice of 2012. So what I have to tell you is that according to this viewpoint, that's an erroneous ending date, and that he uses the ending date of October 28th, 2011. So I have absolutely no interest in discussing or debating what is the proper ending date. I'll simply say that I resonate with this one, and I will also say that recently the head of the Mayan Council of Elders came out in support of this date, came out and said the 2012 date was wrong. Now that doesn't mean that the year 2012 isn't significant, because of course that would mean it's the first pulse of something that comes new after a completion. So for what it's worth, in this view, which we'll see in a minute, the ending date is October 28th of 2011, for what it's worth. So this is a chart that gives all of the basic 9 underworlds. And this is where it gets really interesting, and I'm going to have to start really, if you think I've been making only broad strokes so far, the strokes might get broader now. But you'll see how large of a time frame we're talking about, because when we look at the base, what they call the Cellular Underworld, we're going back 16.4 billion years, which is basically speculative, the time of the theoretical Big Bang, or the first creation of the physical matter, okay? So most people don't realize that. I didn't realize that the Mayan calendar accounts for such a broad time span, okay? But what most people think of, and what the Mayans themselves called the long count, starts right here. So basically, these first 5 levels of the pyramid, or these first 5 stages of evolution, are not focused on. There is evidence that they understood the existence of them, and so he's charted them out. But where they start and where we're going to focus is here at what's called the National Underworld from here on. And the National Underworld started 5,125 years ago, roughly 3,100 BC. Now, this I find very interesting and exciting, because in the Mayan mythology, in their view, they talk about that at the beginning of this underworld, the first father raised the world tree. Okay? So there's some notion that there was a particular transition here. And when we look at it in terms of what was going on there, this is when written language developed, okay? Now, part of their tradition, both the Norse tradition and the Mayan tradition, in their mythology, they talk and they say that the first humans were born from the world tree. And you think, well, what could that mean? But then it's very interesting when you look at where the world tree axis goes through at 13 degrees east longitude. It goes right down through Africa, including through the country Chad, which is where it's currently believed the first humans did develop. So you start to see that what the native peoples, what the indigenous peoples were representing symbolically, has this validation once you start to understand what they meant by it, you know? So it's really neat to say that, it's kind of a cool way to say it, that the human beings were first born from the world tree. But at this time in history, you know how there's these qualitative leaps that are made in evolution that can't really be accounted for by any Darwinian notion. this was definitely a period of one of those leaps where suddenly advanced civilizations were appearing and there was no known reason for why they would suddenly appear. But once you understand that it was the emergence of a new underworld, the emergence of the next level of consciousness, suddenly there you realize, okay, now the cosmic emanations were supporting that. And so we, being influenced by that, human beings at that time respond to it. So this beginning, I should have written down, I don't remember the exact dates, but this is so astounding when you get this. This emergence is what mythologically is called the Great Fall, or the Great Expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And in the timing of the Jewish Bible, it's not exactly 5,125 years, but in the Jewish Bible, they have a dating for the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, and it roughly correlates to this. Same thing in the Vedic traditions when they talk about the Kali Yuga, if you've heard that term. The beginning of the Kali Yuga roughly corresponds to that date. But here's what was so exciting to me when I first got this from Calleman, is this National Underworld and the emergence of writing that it made possible was the first time that the way the emanations were coming in, it supported dualism. Previous to that, it was a unitary event. Do you resonate with that? Suddenly, duality emerges. And what do we see in the myth of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden? We see that there's the tree of life and there's the tree of knowledge, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil being duality. And when you eat from that tree of the knowledge of duality, you are out from the garden. Not because there's a punitive God, punishing you that way, but because duality is to be in a state where you're constantly moving from past to present and not just residing in the present moment from past to future. Do you see that? We all kind of intuitively feel that, don't we? I just thought this was so amazing when I made this connection that the emergence of this underworld was the expulsion from the garden. Now, the other thing that's exciting about that, which is true in the other, Newman's book and Wilbur's book, is the idea and the understanding that the evolution, including the evolution of kind of the extreme state that we're in, of extreme, scientific materialism run amok, let's say, nonetheless, that has been part of the evolutionary plan, for sure. Okay? That it's not been a terrible mistake. And when you realize that, that is like really good news, isn't it? Because if it was if it was all one big mistake that we had to somehow figure out how to correct, it'd be like, being, up a creek without a paddle, for sure. But when you realize that, no, there are these emanations that the whole planet responds to, it's such a relief because you realize that, just like he says, they're beyond human manipulation, okay? Now, I just want to say something. So from now on, have you seen that film called The Power of 10? Where they start out at a human level, and then they do it microscopically. They go down smaller and smaller to the power of 10, then they come back to the human level, and then they go out bigger and bigger to the power of 10. Well, if you can hold that image in mind as we go through these next charts, that will help. Because what we're doing right now is we've got the biggest time frame. And now the next one we're going to come down to is only going to account for these 4 underworlds. We're going to leave all these kind of happily in our evolutionary past, although they're still happening. And so from now on, we're just going to focus from here up. What I want to say, maybe you won't have this problem, but I had a heck of a time getting on to the names of the underworlds. Because if you look at them, the National Underworld started in 3100 BC. There was no divination. So each underworld is named for what it's evolving to. And you have to think not in terms of where it's at the beginning, but what it's evolving to, okay? And that threw me because, planetary underworld starts around 1755, which is when nation states are developing, and yet it's called planetary because it's evolving towards where we are now, which is becoming one planet. This galactic underworld that we're in now, which he calls the apocalyptic age, it's evolving us to being, obviously, conscious participants in the whole galaxy. And the last underworld, which we haven't quite evolved to yet, is the universal, which is the one, really good news, that's going to finally end the rule of duality and be the support for returning to unity consciousness, but returning to unity consciousness with everything that's been developed by having gone through all these stages of dualism. Do you see that? Isn't that just like, woo? I think it's amazing. Okay, so this from here on is what the Mayans call the long count. When you hear the term the long count, it means this basically 5,100-year period of time from when the National Underworld first emerges. And it correlates to written language, the expulsion from the garden, the dualistic beginning awareness, okay? And if any of you end up being curious, he takes all of this. So here we have just the 4 underworlds now. He'll look at the history of religion and correlate it to all the stages, okay? He'll look at the history economically, the history of money and commerce, and correlate it through all the stages. He'll look at communication, the written world, the publishing, all of that evolution of communication, and he'll correlate it to all of it. And he does all of that to really lay the groundwork to show and to document that these stages aren't just hypothetical, that they actually do correspond to historical movements. And again, I don't have time to cover all that. I'm going to pick out a few favorite examples, but I certainly won't have time to cover all of it. Yes, I'm sorry. So, I'll try to read. We're not going to cover this whole graph, obviously. But there were a few things I wanted to say about it. Okay, so at the beginning of the National Underworld, I already mentioned, we have the raising of the world tree. Okay, and the expulsion from the garden. And then you can see, here's the 7 days and 6 nights, or the 13 heavens, all the different stages. And in this underworld, each day is, I've got it written down here, over 5,000 years. Okay, so we're talking about long time spans of development through this part. Okay. And then, and this is, remember the pyramid, each level emerging out of the previous one. What happens is as you reach the 13th heaven, or the 7th day of any particular underworld, that's when the next underworld emerges, okay? So I'm going to ignore all these, all these hundreds of years of history here, which he does document, and just jump ahead. We're going to see, now this is, the Hermetic principle that says as above, so below? This uses that, but it also uses the similar or an analogous principle, which is as in the long cycle, so in the short cycle, or as in a short cycle, so in a long cycle. That if you understand the basic rhythms or pulsations, they hold true whether you're looking at a long time span or a short one, okay? That's why he spends so much time documenting all of this, so that when he comes around to making his predictions for what we're likely to move through in these last few years, you have a basis for seeing that he's not just making it up out of his head, out of the top of his hat. So I'll mention that because night 5 is oftentimes, you can see the energy is destruction. So night 5 oftentimes correlates with a very difficult, destructive period. And it's interesting to see that in the National Underworld, it covers the centuries that we refer to as the Dark Ages, so that's kind of interesting. But if we jump down here to the day 7, starting in 1617, I thought I'd read you, just to give you, again, kind of a flavor, a few examples of what begins. So he says that the emanations that are coming for this particular day is supporting the West, okay? And specifically supporting the rise of the British Empire. Now, when you think about the British Empire, I mean, here's a little tiny, really, a little island, a little country that would become the #1 world power. It's like, what are the chances? And of course, the English at the height of their power, like any peoples at the height of their power, like to think that it's because they're so special, they're so smart, they're so hardworking, or they're so whatever. But in fact, you start to see that no, it's simply that the winds of history were supporting them at that time. So at the beginning of day 7, which begins in the year 1617, there's a support for the British Empire. So here I'll read you some dates that he says. Now this is still what he's calling a polarized energy, okay? The beginning in 1617 of a period of almost 400 years of increasing world dominance by the West and a separation of the cultures of West and East. The buildup of the British Empire began with its first trading post in India in the year 1615 and the arrival of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts in 1620, which is the starting point of the development of the United States. Linked to this Western dominance is a number of phenomena that are emerged around the beginning of this same heaven, such as Protestantism, capitalism, and science, all expressions of the left hemisphere of the human brain. It is ultimately this duality, which was initially introduced when the first father raised the world tree all the way back in 3100 BC, that has created the patriarchal, judgmental, evaluating mind. Okay. So again, that's just a taste, but hopefully it gives you some sense of that. And as this heaven starts, then suddenly the next underworld, which is called the Planetary Underworld, emerges beginning in 1755. So not that far into this one emerges. And this is the energy in the Planetary Underworld. The emanations from the world tree have supported the dominance of the United States. So this is part of the support for how, it's all part of the Western dominance, but the shift here from Britain gradually giving way to the United States. So you can see that when these energies come in, it's not apparent. It's not like in 1755 when this underworld started, it would be clear to anyone living on the planet at that time that the United States was going to emerge as a world power. The United States was just this little group of a few colonialists living on the East Coast. But nonetheless, in retrospect, we can go back and we can see, okay, day 1, 1755 to 1775, indeed, we see that it did, the seed time, the sowing energy of day 1, seeded the birth of the United States. So you start to get that sense of how these things unfold, okay? And you'll notice again the ending date is always down here, October 28th. So each new level emerges out of the old one, and then they coexist together, okay? So the 7th day of this underworld began on 1992, and just 7 years later, on January 5th of 1995, the Galactic Underworld began, okay? This one being the one that he says corresponds to the apocalyptic age. Let me see. See if these notes are worth reading or not.
So are you going to tell us where we are now?
Yes, I'm definitely going to try to save time for that. Because, oh, yes. I'll just mention one thing that is very important. So the beginning of this is when the support for duality came into play, okay? With the emergence of this, What came into play was the support for materialism, for a masking or a hiding of the spiritual dimension or spiritual reality. And indeed, you can see, and what does America almost stand for, is the kind of the zenith of materialism, aren't we? But so this underworld supported duality, this underworld added to that a support for materialism and a hiding then of the spiritual realities. And so I'll tie this back to the world tree because Calleman says, and it seems obvious, that in the planetary underworld then, the world soul, the world tree, the world mountain, all of these poetic, symbolic concepts that were real understandings of real energies, real realities, became lost and submerged under the planetary underworld. But that in the galactic underworld, the basis for the re-emergence of understanding them exist. And he specifically tied it into the Venus transit that happened, I think, in day 3. He called that Venus transit a seeding for the awareness of the world tree to come back into existence. And a year later, it started showing up for me. Yes, what was your question,
I
Arisa?
just had this epiphany
Okay, yes?
that if we were in a position of coming into duality, the tension of that is so great that it makes perfect sense that we would try to go into oneness by hiding the spirituality and just having the materialism.
Yes.
So that that tension isn't so great. So it makes real sense, even as human beings, that, you know, it's a fix for this.
That's right. Once we're this far cut off from the understanding and participation in a living cosmos. This is what all these cosmologies and these original, peoples, they had a sense of a being participants in a living cosmos. And under the influence of materialism, we've lost that. We tend to see it as matter as being a resource. Even environmentalists sometimes approach the world, not all, but sometimes just approach it as that we need to be good stewards of the world. Or that we need to protect our home planet so that we have the resources we need. But this goes much deeper. This is like the awareness of being in a living cosmos, being participants, being members of a web of life. Okay, so it's a deeper awareness and understanding. And this might be a moment too. One of the talks I gave here was called Dancing with the Ancestors. And in the description for that, I said something like the ancestors hold in trust a love of the land, a love and a tradition of service to the land that we need to recover. And since giving that talk, what I realize is the ancestors also hold in trust this understanding of the world tree, this understanding of the cosmic tree, this understanding of a living cosmos. And so for myself, I feel that that's part of why my own experience has come forward to suddenly be aware of the world tree, is because by opening up my ancestral connections, that link, that flow of remembering was able to come through, as well as running across this piece of information. Okay, so now what we're going to start to do is gear in a little more on this galactic underworld that we're going to be, or are, in the midst of. Oh, I forgot about this one. Okay, what this serves a simple function. So these are the same underworlds, just showing the duration and the length of each day, or heaven, okay? And I wanted to show this for 2 reasons. We all subjectively have that feeling or awareness that time is speeding up. Well, when you look at this, you really see a real explanation, a real validation that time is speeding up. Because in the National Underworld, one day took 394 years to unfold. In the Planetary Underworld, that same day only took 19.7 years to unfold. Now, we're moving through a day in 360 days. And hold on to your hats, because when we hit the Universal Underworld in the year 2011, we'll move through an entire day in 20 days. So he's really saying, and this is part of why he's wanting to get the understanding of this out, because he's saying if you try to hold on to a dualistic, materialistic framework under a frequency that's going to be so much about giving it up. The stress level that people will experience, he says stress, he defines stress as living in such a way that you're out of sync with the cosmic impulse. And if we're under stress now, think about how when it speeds up even more. So I loved this simple idea that this gives a perspective or an explanation for our subjective experience that time is indeed speeding up. The other thing about this that I wanted to mention is I've gone for many years, say, to satsangs with Gangaji. And she, with many other people, will say that in the past, only a few saints became self-realized. That awakening or enlightenment seemed to be reserved for a privileged few. But that today is for ordinary people. That today, ordinary people can wake up. But she never gives an explanation for why that's true. She just says that it's true. But again, when you understand this, you see, okay, but now we have the world tree, the cosmic tree, the evolutionary stage, supporting people waking up. And especially as we move into this universal underworld, this is the underworld that's designed to support people awakening. Now, what you have to remember, and this goes back, I'm going to show you these 9 levels. Each level emerges out of and builds on the previous, and they do not replace it. So that means when these new underworlds emerge, it doesn't mean that everyone on the planet automatically, blip, like magic, is in that consciousness. It doesn't work quite like that. But what it does mean is that there is now an irresistible support. Okay? So the Galactic Underworld means there is no longer support for Western dominance on the planet. The support from the world tree has now moved to the east. Okay? And you can see that, you can begin to see that politically. You know, people know that China is on the ascendancy. India will probably play a key role. There's also, in a way that I can't take time to explain, there's a support for how these emanations at a certain point support a movement north, which he interprets to mean that Russia will probably end up playing a key role. But the idea is yes, there's a new movement, and it's real, and over time you see the signs of it, but it doesn't automatically mean these other levels don't exist. So that's where I think sometimes people use the Mayan calendar in kind of a magical way, like we're all going to wake up in the year 2012 and it's going to be like fairyland. See, I don't think that's true. And it's certainly not true that it means the world ends. It just means that this rule of the dualistic mind is no longer being supported. So dualistic thinking is what ends with the ending of the Mayan long count. Okay? All right, so moving right along. So this is a very brief look at the so-called planetary underworld. This is the one that introduced materialism and that introduced support for the United States. The reason I put it up here, we're not going to go through most of it, but again, just to point out that in the days, there's more of a surge ahead, in the nights, in this, often corresponded to economic crisis during the day. And during the nights, and night 5 is always the one that's particularly challenging. Night 5 in this underworld covered the years of the Great Depression and of the Second World War, of the atomic bomb. You know, when you think about what happened in that 20-year frame, I'm just trying to make that awareness that night 5 is often the most challenging. But even day 5, which is what we're approaching, day 5 of the Galactic Underworld starts on Thanksgiving of this year. Okay, so the midpoint, the workshop I'm doing this Saturday is for the midpoint of the 4th night, and then by Thanksgiving we're at the beginning of the 5th day. So the 5th day is ruled by the god of light, and you can be kind of optimistic, but when you go back and you see what happened from 1913 to 1932, there were 2 extremely devastating things. One is World War I, and 2 is the 1918 flu epidemic, which actually killed way more people than the war did. Okay? So that's good to be aware of because, again, even though day 5 is basically an energy that's about breakthrough, there is often a reaction to that breakthrough. And what the breakthrough was in this world is this is definitely the emergence of the modern era. When you go back and you realize that from this time on, you know, in terms of going from the League of Nations to the United Nations, to having communication, to having industrial capability, all of those kind of things that had been developing through all these stages definitely emerged into modern, recognizably modern life during day 5. So that's a significant thing, but that there's also a reaction to it. That's the point. Okay, so here are the actual dates now for the Galactic Underworld, the one that we're currently newly in. It emerged day 1, January 5th of 1999. Here the days and nights are roughly, well, they are basically a year duration, in the Mayan count being a 360-day count. And we are currently at this midpoint of night 4. So this is where we already currently are. Getting ready on Thanksgiving to move into day 5. So based on what he sees and has documented of how these days work historically, he feels that we should be aware and prepared for the fact that day 5 and especially night 5 will really be particularly challenging times on the planet. Night 5 is roughly the year 2008. And he says in terms of an economic collapse, that this would be the time frame in which it happens. Because every time you look at night 5, there's some kind of economic difficulty. So I'll mention there's a speaker coming Saturday night here to the library, Frank someone, who speaks specifically using this information and applying it as an economist to advise you on investments and things like that. So, you know, I'm not interested in that part of it, but just know that if you walk away with nothing else, 2008 stands to be a particularly trying year. Now, the statement which I found intriguing, that this is the apocalyptic times. I came to a talk here by a man named Victor Zelikovsky, who wrote on biblical prophecy. And evidently, a biblical prophecy is quite clear that if you accept this whole thing, which he gave good validation for this as well, that the rule of the Antichrist will last for 3.5 years. And again, in the Judaic Bible, or in the Judaic tradition, a year is 360 days, just like in the Mayan tradition. So now, this is all speculation, right? But nonetheless, I find it intriguing to think the rule of the Antichrist hasn't started yet, okay? But if it's going to happen, it's got to happen fairly soon. And it's interesting to speculate from the midpoint of night 5 to the ending of this process is 3.5 years. So it's just interesting to notice that there might be an overlap there. I only mention that, again, for your interest and to pay attention. But Victor's interest was like Calleman's and like mine, trying to give people a sense of perspective as we move along. Like he said, if you were living in the middle of the Holocaust, it would be helpful to know that Hitler's rule wasn't going to last forever. So it's the same thing. If we end up under the rule of the Antichrist, it'd be really helpful to know it will only last 3.5 years, according to biblical prophecy and Mayan calendar perspective. By the way, I don't have any of the details on this, but I was at a Grandmother's Council meeting yesterday, and a woman there mentioned that, you know, have you heard of this idea of introducing the microchips into people? Evidently, that's gone now. We've known it's been in preparatory stages, but Bush has now evidently moved to introduce legislation to move ahead with that. And one state, Minnesota, has used their prerogative to pass legislation as a state saying that they want to opt out of that program. So this woman was interested in getting Oregon to pass similar legislation. But in this apocalyptic age kind of speculation, those microchips are sometimes referred to as the mark of the beast, which is referred to in the book of Revelations. So again, it's just, this is all speculation of playing with how we're moving through this apocalyptic time. So what these are just some of the dates. The beginning and then the midpoints. So here's the midpoint that the workshop on Saturday is to observe. I hope some of you will come to the workshop and participate in terms of attuning energetically to these emanations from the world tree and to what's happening at this midpoint. But if you can't come, then on your own, just be aware. And Thanksgiving, be aware, that's the beginning of the 5th day. So if any of you, you can go to his website or come to my handout and get these dates if you want. But it's useful because what he's saying is that, we're all under the Gregorian calendar. Here, let me finish this last thing so we can turn this off and then I'll finish up some ideas. I wanted to share this with you because I think it's so beautiful. This is a Mayan phrase of how they would use to greet one another. In la'ek, I have no idea how you say it. Okay, thank you. And it means, I am another you. And it's that recognition of oneness. It's that recognition that we are participants in a living web of life, that the planet is a living web of life, that the cosmos is a living cosmos. And it's the acknowledgement of oneness then. So I just thought this was such a beautiful phrase. I wanted to share it with you, that this is part of the understanding and philosophy that we're working our way back to.
May I ask, what
Sure.
was that night 6? You had each one, like one was budding and then another one was flowering.
Yes.
And the night 6 is right before the day 7 evolution. So,
Yes, let me see if I can find that. Night 6 was called fine-tuning.
is what?
Fine-tuning.
Oh, fine-tuning.
Mm-hmm, fine-tuning.
Thank you. That's very good. Fine-tuning.
Yeah, fine-tuning. That's right. Fine-tuning for final resolution. Okay. Thank you for your attention. I know this has been a lot to try to absorb and take in, but so I want to come back a little bit more, like I said, to the world tree and some of my understanding. This, by the way, is the flyer. I'm going to do another talk next month on Earth energies and then also another workshop, so I just mentioned that. So I'll finish up the reflection on the Gregorian calendar before I move into the tying it into Bert Hellinger work. It's, one of those things that we all know, the power of conditioning. But Calleman advocates that people start to pay attention to days according to the Mayan calendar, okay? Because he says the Gregorian calendar, which is what we all use, was introduced in the 1500s. I forget the exact year, but 1500 something. And what he says is that that calendar imposes a certain worldview that we all automatically are conditioned into every time. And it is interesting to think, like when we say, oh, it's Wednesday, May 24th, 2006, we all feel somehow oriented in space and time, don't we? It's as if we're saying something real when we say that, but of course, it's only an agreed upon convention. And yet, it's interesting to notice how oriented we feel when we say, oh, it's Wednesday, May 24th. So I have started to try, in my appointment book, on every day I write down, what is the Mayan sign and number and everything. But I have to say it's not easy to undo, 50 years of conditioning. So it doesn't come natural to me yet at all. But I've started to pay attention. And it's the same thing about tuning into these different dates. It's not that you'll necessarily notice anything in particular. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But it simply begins to bring your consciousness and to bring your planetary field, your world tree, into alignment with the planetary and cosmic one. And it's very, very powerful. This is where I said, I have my own experience in terms of the importance of the world tree. And evidently I'm one of the seed persons to be able to start helping other people notice that because of my experiences. I've spent the last 10 years traveling a lot and knowing that I was traveling to connect with the land, but not always knowing a lot more than that. But somehow spending that time, a lot of time in nature, a lot of time in different places on the planet, and then working with the Burt-Hellinger family constellations through that, and how that opened up my own sense of ancestral connection. And then going to this talk by the Mayan Calendar and having the world tree brought into my conscious awareness again for the first time after all these years. And then participating in some constellations where I was asked to represent the world tree. And one person here was at that particular constellation. It was one that we were setting up on the collective level to deal with the issue of peace, wanting to set up a constellation that would somehow address the issue of how to create more peace on the planet. And I was asked to represent inwardly. I got the guidance. I was supposed to represent the world tree. It was such a powerful, beautiful experience. And it's hard to describe, and any description wouldn't quite communicate the power of it. But when some humans, the people that were representing different human groups on the planet, finally noticed the world tree and bowed to the tree, that's the movement that created the resolution of that constellation. Do you remember that? It was so beautiful, so powerful. And it was like my direct awareness of just how significant it is to remember the world tree and to begin to align with that. And as I said at the beginning, to think of ourselves, at least what I like thinking of myself now, is as a caretaker of the earth. And that's what I wanted to get to now is I really am encouraging you to pay attention to the world tree and to the world soul. But it's very significant how we approach that. Because if you go in, even with the best of intentions of like, oh, now I'm going to, somehow do something for the world tree or with the world tree, that's an arrogance and a misunderstanding of our place, okay? But if you show up in an attitude of humility and in an attitude of service, the field itself then informs you of what is needed. And so it gives us the right place, which is that paradox between how inconsequential we are and that what happens on the planet isn't really up to us, that there is a divine plan at work that is beyond our ability to manipulate, and what good news that is. But on the other hand, it absolutely requires our conscious participation. So while our actions are inconsequential on one hand, they're essential on the other hand at the same time. And it's holding that balance that opens up the appropriate place for us to approach these energies. And if you look at the traditional cultures, the tribal peoples, they have that quality of humility, and they have that quality of being caretakers of the earth, of approaching it in a spirit of service. So I find that that's very, very important. Now, I had hoped to talk a little bit more about how these winds work, but I'm not going to do that at this point. But it's through the constellation work that you can very directly access what we call the field. And then you let the field inform you what needs to happen. You don't go in there with the idea of what needs to happen, but if you're present in the field itself informs you what needs to happen, and then you serve that. That's the proper relationship. But we've never really understood, okay, we talk about that these fields are morphogenetic fields, but we've never actually maybe fully understood where these morphogenetic fields created. So this is kind of the neat awareness. See, it's the tree that creates the field. So by attuning and being aware of the tree, you're more directly aligning with the source emanation for these fields. Do you see that? It's really quite astounding. So I'm very excited by that. And I wanted to share with you then a couple quotes from Bert Hellinger. Now, Bert Hellinger himself, as far as I know, has no awareness of the world tree. His role was, definitely to bring back into awareness accessing these fields. So we all owe a tremendous gratitude to him for that. But, his work is continuing to evolve and unfold as we move through these underworlds. And now the support is here for relating to the fields at the collective levels in a somewhat more conscious way, which is part of where I see my role developing to my amazement. So anyway, I wanted to read you some quotes that I hope will help create this sense of how to work with this. So, okay, I'll just read them and hopefully they'll speak for themselves or I'll comment. Here's one. All this overthrowing, reforming, or bettering of the world proceeds from an illusion that I can do it, it's in my hands. With that attitude, the connection to the effects at a depth is lost, and usually the result is terrible. But if I withdraw and remain true to the deeper powers, I emanate a quality that works on others in a peaceful, moderating, reconciling way. This is a man who's in his 80s now. He's German. He lived through everything that happened in Europe and lived in Africa and has seen the devastation of what's been wreaked in Africa. So he's seen all these social movements that start out thinking they're out to accomplish something good. And this is where his wisdom has led him to. Okay? And again, that word emanating, because that's all the world tree does. The world tree isn't sitting around trying to figure out the problems on the world, The world tree is just emanating this pulse wave. Okay, here's another quote. People involved in movements think that it's possible to enforce a particular idea over time and to be in control of events. But I see these things more as historical movements in which all are taken into service for the good and for the bad. The idea of people having freedom in their actions seems a complete illusion to me. No one can resist the general movement of history. Now, he may not have known about the world tree and the winds of history, the winds of change, but he does know, doesn't he? So that's what he's saying. We're called into service to these movements. Okay? Here's another quote. My basic stance is to agree to the world as it is. I don't declare one movement good and the other bad. I see them both tied together in an overriding process, and I submit to this process. Okay? So it's a more humble, but it turns out also more powerful posture in the world. And he just observes that even positive movements have bad effects and even bad movements have positive effects. Okay? Two more quotes. The soul doesn't follow socio-political rules. You can't convince the soul with arguments based on an ideology. Neither can you say that the deep processes of the soul are dependent on socialization. All that we can see is that souls in our culture react in a similar way. Okay? And here's the last quote I'll read. Okay? When you realize that you are called into service, and when you submit to that, you go down a path that you never could have thought up on your own. I'll testify to that one big time. The goal is not clear, and the next steps are in the dark. You are in harmony with the way, but you don't know exactly where it leads. Then, as a rule, you're led towards something that is greater and more fulfilling than is someone who is simply self-reliant. Isn't that beautiful? Pardon?
Did you read the last sentence?
Yes. So if you're in harmony with the way, even if you don't know where it leads, then as a rule, you're led towards something that is greater and more fulfilling than is someone who is simply being self-reliant. Okay? And that is definitely my experience. That's the only thing that has brought me to this moment in time to speak on aligning with the world tree. Not anything that I ever could have imagined on my own, but something that by following my path each step of the way, this is, the current moment. So you are now all part of a new seed group. Like it or not, however it settles with you or not, the seed of this understanding has been planted in your awareness. And my hope and my intention is that it will grow and bear fruit. It feels really good to be here in Ashland in a community of caretakers of the earth. And as I said, I really feel that though I enjoy this part of, disseminating ideas and helping to bring awareness through talks, it's actually through the energetic work, through the meditations, through participating in constellations, through being in nature and attuning to the earth energies itself. That's where the real magic is. That's where the real power is. And that's where my particular role definitely is. So I invite you to participate as you're moved to, and just to explore and share it on your own to whatever way this draws you. So, questions, reactions? Yes, go ahead.
How do you, or do you have a plan to have the Mayan calendar expand? In other words, to get more people aware about the Mayan calendar, because I think I had read not too long ago that, or some time ago, that Jose Arguelles, who lives here, I guess, had taken this information to the last Pope about how if the Mayan calendar were changed and made it a world calendar, there would be so much more peace, and somehow it was, I guess, rejected.
Right.
So how do you?
Certainly, I don't see myself having any role in that. I'm not opposed to it at all, but I don't sense a role for myself in that. Even to what extent I'll be speaking on the Mayan calendar again, I have no clue. What I feel is that I have a role to play on helping people understand and relate to the world tree. And that, is hopefully I've succeeded in showing in broad strokes the Mayan calendar is very helpful with and supportive of. But in terms of me personally, that's where I feel my work is, not in trying to. Calleman himself, though, is, as well as Jose, as you mentioned, and other people are, and in fact, that's a good reminder now. Mel Gibson evidently has a new movie scheduled to come out this summer called Apocalypse. And so, yes, and so they're feeling that when this movie comes out, it will create a lot of, discussion and brouhaha around these kinds of issues. And so Calleman and others are working to set up a particular website portal that will help spread the awareness and understanding of the Mayan calendar and how it can help us move through these years. So if any of you, I have this printed out, if any of you are interested in that, then you can definitely either through the website or through looking at this, check that out.
Which website?
That's Calleman.com. And but anyway, there's a couple different websites in here mentioned, and there's also the website for the movie if you're curious about the movie. Yes.
So when you're also an astrologist.
Yes.
Are we talking about apples and oranges here? Is there any correlation, or are they just talking about two different things? And
it's really there's overlap, of course, and the Mayans. It's interesting. The Mayans paid a lot of attention, of course, to the moon. All people that live close to land pay attention to the moon for farming and the tides and all of that. Paid a lot of attention to the sun. Not surprising. But what is kind of surprising is they paid a tremendous amount of attention to Venus, which is partly why Calleman then ties these Venus transits as having a significance in all of that. So, everything is one field ultimately, so everything works together. But as an astrologer, I'd have to say that there's no combination of transits or understanding of transits that brings any kind of clarity to history like the Mayan calendar does. No comparison. Hands down, this is better. Okay? And Calleman goes to great lengths to say that it's not tied into astrology because astrology is based on movements of planets, which are material. And the whole awareness he's trying to get through with this is that it's consciousness that is primary, and that these movements are emanations of consciousness. They're not dictated or mainly movements in the physical world. So that's the distinction that he wants people to grasp, if you will.
One other question. Is there some way in which you could loosely translate the universal world tree as God? I mean, it seems like to me that is God. I mean, because God is everywhere and God influences everything. That seems like to me that could be a definition of God.
And I think that's why they call them heavens, because it is the divine creation cycle. So yes. A question here, and then we'll come up here.
I just wanted to, Bert Hallinger, is that what you're saying? Does he have a website, or do you have a source for that? Or the spelling, is it just H-A-L-L-I-N-G-E-R?
Yeah, I wrote it down for you. That's right, I did kind of presume that you knew about him, but I gave a talk called Dancing with the Ancestors. It's on DVD, and you could check that out, and it's developed more in there. But I'll just put his name right up here. He doesn't have a website. He's in his 80s, and but there are websites for the work, which I can't think of offhand right now what it is, but I can help you look it up if you want.
There's a guy here in town who's doing a lot of Bert Hellinger work named Stephen Victor. He's given an intro to the work on the 2nd of June. That's in spring, 6:30.
Yes, and I know Stephen. I can definitely recommend his work. He's very good. And I'll be starting to facilitate more constellations as well. And there's other people around. It's a work that's growing in popularity, we'll say, because it's it really, when you start to realize what it makes possible, it's quite exciting. So,
This has been a really... It is on. Okay. This has been a really terrific little talk tonight, and I've enjoyed it so much, and I feel like I have learned a lot, or at least got some kind of a overview here of the Mayan calendar, but I still feel at loss here as to what your workshop covers on Saturday and what to expect and what that format is. Can you speak to that, please?
Yes, I will try to, although I have to say that I like to use the quip that one of my teachers used, which is, if I have a plan, we're all in big trouble. So I don't always know what's going to happen, but I've been prepared over many years. I started out as an individual soul level healer, and my training was very much simply about being present and then allowing the field of the soul, although we didn't use the word field, we just said soul, to allow the other person's soul to inform what needs to happen. So the healing work that I was trained in was never about me presuming to know what needed to happen and then going in and trying to help facilitate that. It was always about being present and allowing whatever needed to come through. So that was my training, and I still do those individual sessions, what's called Self Attunement. But that has evolved over time, and through this unexpected journey I've taken to connecting with earth energies and collective levels of energies. So at this particular workshop on Saturday is specifically for the purpose of aligning with the midpoint of the fourth night, which is where we're at in this cycle. So it will be a combination of meditation and setting up constellations. What those constellations will be exactly, we won't know till we get there and find out. But so I may do some amount of presentation and clarification around some of this, but mainly it won't be talking. Mainly this will be the energetic part of it, where we actually attune to the energy and align to the energy and see what wants to happen.
And this is, in fact, your absolute passion, because you have so much passion over here that you must be off the charts.
Well, you know, by temperament, I'm kind of a low-key, understated person, so I wasn't even sure if my excitement around this would come through, because, you know, I'm not like one of those people that gets really, but yes, this is a deep passion of mine. You know, if you look over the different talks I've done, even just since I've been a national, it may seem like I'm jumping from strange topic to strange topic, but there is an underlying thread, and part of that underlying thread is love for the planet and really wanting to serve what happens on the planet during this time. And, you know, I definitely have given my life to that, and I would never have taken the journey I've taken over these last years of living as a wanderer if it wasn't for following that. So yes, that's very much my passion, is to be a caretaker of the earth. And
I find you to be very clear, concise, and very smart.
Yeah, well, all those years of reading have to somehow work out something, right? But, you know, believe me, you know, yeah, well, okay, thank you. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Just want to say, a couple of us here had attended her last workshop, and when she starts this meditation, it's on, yeah. When she starts this meditation and you all enter in, I left that place feeling like a wet noodle because of the level of because of the intensities that came about. So
yeah, I don't know if that really sells the workshop. Come and feel like a wet noodle.
But all I'm saying is, be prepared, you know, to really enter into the energy of the situation. It's very effective.
I really don't know what will happen, but I really trust that, you know, even when I give these talks, energy work comes through before I give them, and that's what I trust, because otherwise, you know, little me, would I get up and try to explain all this? But when I have that sense that, yes, this is something that needs to be communicated, then, you know, I trust that it comes through as needed. So that's certainly my desire. Anything else? Any other questions or responses? So hooray for the planet, hooray for consciousness, hooray for moving back to unity understanding. And thank you all very much for coming.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax-deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.